So before the video starts, I did want to let you know that this is going to be kind of a long video. There's a lot to talk about here. I'm not going to just be talking about my Game Boy collection. I am going to also be talking about the different systems in that collection, the difference between each individual one, and kind of give you some advice on where to buy some of these systems and games and accessories, just because it's become so hard to find some of them now. I am going to be leaving timestamps for each particular section in case you're not interested about learning about the different systems. You can just skip to my game collection. But if you are here for the whole ride, thank you so much. I appreciate you so much. There's so much to talk about here. I'm very passionate about this system in particular because it is the first video game system I personally have ever owned. Let's go ahead and start talking about the original Game Boy Advance model. Now, I didn't necessarily grow up with the Game Boy Advance, the original version you could say, and that's just mainly due to the fact that I grew up with the Game Boy Advance SP, which will be the next model we talk about. So I didn't grow up with this original model. However, I do appreciate this model just for some of the advancements it did. It allowed you to do backwards compatibility with old Game Boy games and Game Boy Advance games. There are a lot of small benefits towards this original model. It is the most comfortable to hold, and also it does have a headphone jack. One of the biggest disadvantages to the Game Boy Advance, especially the original one, was that it didn't have a front light or back light. Now there's a difference between having a front light or back light, and I will get into that as well, but this system didn't have either of those. You basically had to play underneath a light source of some kind, or you had to get a worm light, which was basically an accessory you would add to this accessory port to the Game Boy Advance that would allow you to play with like a little light, and it would allow you to like see in the dark basically. This was impossible to play during nighttime from what I hear. Now that moves us to the next model of Game Boy, which is the one I grew up with. In fact, this is still the original Game Boy Advance SP AGS001, at least the shell part of it is the original one I had from my childhood. And boy, does this system bring back memories. Now at this point in my life, my parents kind of got sick of me asking to get a Game Boy Advance, and they eventually got me this model when it was kind of the new thing. It was the AGS001, and it was the first Game Boy that came to America that had a front-lit screen. There was another Game Boy that had a backlit screen in Japan called the Game Boy Light, but it wasn't an advanced model. This was a Game Boy Advance that had a front-lit screen, and I can imagine how much of a difference that made for a lot of people back in the day. But for me, it was just so cool to see either way, whether I had the previous systems or not, just because I can see my games, I could play them in the dark. It was actually really cool to have the first of its kind, really, a system that would fold and protect the screen, and something that you can easily put in your pocket at the time. This is really thick to today's standards, you know, with smartphones being probably as thick as like the top portion of this, but at the time this was like amazing, like to have something this small, compact, basically have the power of Super Nintendo in your pocket and have something that would protect the screen. And it was just a joy to have. It had a front lit thing. You can play at nighttime for those long car rides, maybe after a family party or something. And it was just something I have a lot of nostalgia for. It also has a rechargeable battery. The previous system had to be powered through AA batteries. This is the first system that was actually rechargeable. It still has the accessory port for like linking and also maybe other accessories that you wanted to add to it. Now the biggest con I can honestly think of when it comes to the Game Boy Advance SP is unfortunately it doesn't have a headphone jack, and this annoyed the hell out of me and my parents growing up, I'm sure. There were accessories that you can add to the charging port that would allow you to have a headphone jack. Eventually though, there was another model of the Game Boy Advance. The original Game Boy Advance SP just had a front lit display. That is known as the AGS001 model, and that display was lit in the front, kind of like those worm lights you would see for the Game Boy Advance, but just built into the screen. However, eventually Game Boy Advance SP would implement a backlit screen. The main difference was that the screen was backlit, just like, you know, modern smartphones, modern console nowadays, where everything was at its most clear because the screen itself was being lit from behind as opposed to the front. You have to see it to really see the difference between the front lit and backlit. displays, but the backlit displays is just miles better than that front lit one. While I did mention that this was my original AGS 001 shell, I did replace the internals with a AGS 101 model, which is this model over here. However, the AGS 101 model was not the final Game Boy to be released. The final Game Boy to actually be released was this Game Boy Micro over here. As you know, these things just got way more expensive as time gone on, especially with how rare this system is. Not a lot of people even know that the Game Boy Micro exists, and also due to the fact that the Nintendo DS came out around the same time the Game Boy Micro was released, which kind of made you question why would you get a Micro when the Game Boy Advance SP was $20 cheaper at the time than this Game Boy Micro, and the Nintendo DS was like the new thing. It could also play Game Boy Advance games, and it also had like a slightly larger screen, and it was going to be able to play DS games. While the Game Boy Advance SP AGS 101 is my favorite model, I'll have to admit this is the coolest model of Game Boy. I think that really comes down to the fact that this was the coolest looking system at the time. It has a complete metal enclosure. The screen is actually the same quality as the AGS 101 model that I had previously. It also happened to be the most portable console. In fact, it was so small that they included a carrying pouch with the Game Boy Micro. It's actually officially licensed by Nintendo, and it's a nice little place to carry your Game Boy Micro. You're also allowed to have like a little lanyard. While this system did bring back one port, which was the headphone jack, which is probably the most important port to bring back, it did change the charging port. Now to me, that's not necessarily a big deal because I felt like this system was marketed towards people that already did not have a Game Boy Advance SP and just wanted to get in kind of late with something more sleek. So having a different charging port doesn't bug me, but what does bug me is that they got rid of the link cable entirely, which made you have to basically look for these accessories from Nintendo that would allow you to link up with older Game Boy models in order to do multiplayer or anything like that. There were third-party options as well, but they were extremely hard to find, and the Nintendo ones did not really sell that well. So having a link cable for this system is almost impossible nowadays. And that brings me to one of the other cons for trying to get this system now, is that it's just really expensive and really hard to find. Because it didn't sell well, it became kind of a collector's item and became like over the $200 range, which if you know nowadays that gets you a Switch Lite in a lot of cases. So it's kind of spending that cash to get something like this, which is kind of an old system that is really limited and really small. It has to fit a certain niche. Like you have to really want this console, which I really did. And the reason why I really wanted it was just because of how portable it was. And the fact that I can actually plug a headphone jack and play this as an adult and play this at night, play this at work. It's a really cool console to have as an adult, especially nowadays. The only type of game I don't recommend playing on this is maybe like a really long JRPG. You can get away with by playing Pokemon in this, I believe, but if you're trying to play something like Final Fantasy 5 or 6, then it's going to be really hard to play that on a system like this just because there's so much text and the screen is so small. Other than that, platformers, Pokemon games, as I mentioned, work great on this. In fact, I kind of prefer to play them on this because the screen is just so good. It's because the screen is smaller and because it uses the same type of technology that the AGS 101 has, everything just looks that much sharper. So there's a lot of cons to having this. You know, you can't play original Game Boy games on this. You can only play Game Boy Advance games. There's no way to link up to other people. And that also, it is really hard to repair since it is such a vintage item. But I still think if you are interested in looking into a Game Boy Micro, now is probably the best time because I only see it to like becoming more expensive as time goes on, especially for models that are in good condition. Now, modding Game Boys is actually a really big thing. A lot of people tend to mod Game Boys and it's just a really fun thing to do. You can actually fix the biggest con with the Game Boy Advance by just adding a backlight to it now, which is really cool. You can even add a glass cover as the original one is plastic. It scratches up really easily. The glass cover is obviously not going to scratch as easily as the plastic cover, so you can implement a new screen, a more protective layer over it. The thing with that though is that it still doesn't protect your screen completely, but you can say that about a lot of consoles now, and I actually really like the way that the Game Boy Advance models are modded nowadays. that might be something you want to look into if you are looking for an original Game Boy Advance. If you're like me and you love the portability of the Game Boy Advance SP, you like the ability to fold it, you like having a charging cable and a link cable as well into this one system, then I would probably recommend just looking for an AGS 101 model, or doing what I did, getting an AGS 001 model and just putting AGS 101 internals into it. So that way you can kind of get the color you want with the best screen possible. It's a little tricky to do. It involves buying two different Game Boys, but I do think it's something worth doing if you want an AGS 101 screen with an AGS 001 body. However, there are some third-party shells that are of great quality. They do cost a little bit more, and if you really do want a specific design, I would probably recommend looking into something like that. Just really make sure that you end up looking at one of those models with like maybe a really well done refurbished shell if you're planning to buy one of these refurbished models. I personally recommend modding it yourself. If it's not something you're comfortable with and you really want to get one of these nicer looking Game Boy Advance models, just make sure that you're getting something with a decent shell, because it might not always be in the best shell possible. When it comes to modding the Game Boy Micro, it's something I don't really advise, mainly due to the fact that the parts inside tend to be really brittle. This is a collector's item, so getting original parts is already hard as is, so if you really want to customize the way that this thing looks, I'd recommend looking into maybe third-party faceplates. Just make sure you are looking for quality third-party faceplates. Make sure to look at reviews. One thing I could actually recommend a lot of people looking at is a website called Mercari. Now, a lot of you probably know this app, but if you guys are so used to looking at gaming systems and games on something like eBay or Amazon, and especially for these retro games, it's hard to tell whether the quality is in there, and it's really easy to kind of get ripped off on those websites. Mercari tends to be a much better place, in my opinion, a much safer place, because I believe there's like a safer refund policy on Mercari, at least from my experience. So I would probably recommend looking for like systems like this and the game collections that come with it on a website like Mercari. Not sponsored, obviously. These are just where I got the best products in this lineup. It's actually where I got this Game Boy Micro and what inspired me to make this video, just to inform you guys about these systems. Now, before moving on to the games, there's one accessory I did want to talk about for the Game Boy, and it was the link cable for the Game Boy. Now, there are a bunch of link cable, but this Mad Catz one in particular actually connects to the GameCube itself. There are only a few games that utilize this, but it tends to be really cool when it does. Another accessory that I don't have that I would like to mention is an Action Replay or Game Shark. These cheating items are like so expensive. I believe I saw Game Shark for $250. It's something that if I could find for a decent price, I'll probably pick it up. But for most people, I just avoid getting these at all costs. Now, with the accessories and the consoles out of the way, let's finally talk about the games of the Nintendo Game Boy Advance. Now, I do have to preface, I haven't played all of these games. I will be talking in detail about the ones I have played, and if it's a game that I haven't really played, just bear with me. I'm going to briefly talk about what I think about it and move on. Not necessarily a review, just what I think about like the overall concept of the game and what I know about it. Maybe not give my opinion on the actual game itself. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about my Game Boy Advance collection. Finally! Now, I think it's only natural to probably go through the games I probably talked about in other collection videos, but I have gotten some new ones in my collection. As you can see, I have Fire Red and Leaf Green and Emerald and Ruby. If you're wondering why I haven't picked up Sapphire, it's because it's hell of expensive now. At the time of recording my Pokemon collection video, the prices of Pokemon Sapphire, Ruby, Emerald, and the Game Boy Advance lineup of games was kind of pricey, but still, you know, somewhat affordable, around the $50 to $60 range. Now, Pokemon Emerald alone goes for $200, and that's for a copy without the box, just the cartridge alone. I believe Fire Red and Leaf Green go for $120 each, and Ruby goes for $100, so just spending $100 on Pokemon Sapphire to get a similar experience, if not a lesser experience than Pokemon Emerald, to me is just not worth it. I'm just hoping for the price to go down at some point, because Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald did sell pretty well in their day, so for them to be this expensive is very, very rare. I do not recommend buying those at this point in time. There's also a big market on fake versions of these games. Now, this is a fake version of Pokemon Emerald that I have in my hand, and it's pretty obvious to tell, but if you're someone that's going back and looking for these games 10-15 years later after having owned them, you might get bamboozled with one of these fake ones. Please look out when looking for these fake versions. Again, there's a bunch of YouTube videos. I will link some below as reference guides to determine the difference between a fake Game Boy Advance game and a real one. Wait. Yes, this is the real one. Okay, yes, this is the fake one. Even I got confused for a second there, I guess. Now, the next games I want to talk about in my collection are my Final Fantasy titles. I did a whole collection of Final Fantasy, but in that Final Fantasy collection video, you guys might know that at the time, I didn't have any of the original mainline games for the Game Boy Advance. That was just due to the fact that they were really hard to find and expensive, so I was playing these versions on my phone. However, the game store nearby, my local game store, actually found these versions and sold them for a decent price, and I ended up picking them up. So over here we got Final Fantasy 1 and 2 Dawn of Souls. I have played 1 and 2 on the PSP, and I also played them on iOS, and this is another version to get. This is going to be more sprite based, so I might actually go back and give this one a shot. However, another game I actually was looking for quite a long time was Final Fantasy V. Final Fantasy V was the last game I've actually recently played and beaten, and what a journey this game was. I was originally playing this on my phone because finding a Game Boy copy was just extremely hard. I know the iOS version has some benefits with the sound and everything, but the one thing that pulled me back was that the sprites just looked weird to me. They had some nice character portraits, but the sprites themselves just look kind of funky compared to, like, say, other, Super Nintendo era Final Fantasies. So playing Final Fantasy V on the Game Boy Advance, just such a joy from start to finish. I love this game. Now it's like $80 to $90 online. It's really hard to find a copy of Final Fantasy V for the Game Boy Advance, so if you get an opportunity to get this for around the $50 to $60 range, I do think it's worth it, just due to the fact that it's such a classic, fun game. I have to talk about this game separately another day because there's so much I want to say, but we gotta move on. There's a bunch of games to get through. One of my favorite games of all time, Final Fantasy VI, is on the Game Boy Advance. Not much to say here. Again, if you want to know more of my thoughts on Final Fantasy VI and the other Final Fantasy games in the series, I definitely recommend watching that Final Fantasy collection video because I do go really in depth about each particular title that I played. I don't want to do that here because since it's a general game collection video, I don't want to get into spoilers. So if you want to know my in-depth thoughts about Pokemon games or Final Fantasy games, I do have separate collection videos. Go ahead, you can click on that anytime that you want. I'm not gonna tell you what to do. Now finally getting into my final Final Fantasy game on this system is Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. I have not played this yet, again. And finally, before moving on to games I've never talked about before, I gotta mention Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Red Rescue Team. It's a really cute Pokemon game where you are the Pokemon in this scenario. You're kind of going through adventures with your other Pokemon buddies and kind of just learning more about the world and the legendaries. Recently remade it for the Switch actually, but I still prefer this version just because I do like the style of like the 32-bit art style that this presents. And it's just, I just find this one to be a little bit cuter, and I don't know. I really like this version though, so I recommend picking it up if you can get it for a decent price. Now I get to talk about games that I haven't talked about on this channel before, so I will be going a little bit more in depth with these games since I don't have these games in other collection videos. So let's get at it. I think it's only natural to start with some of the platformers I do have for this system, and I do want to start with Sonic Advance 2. Now this is the only Sonic Advance title that I have in my collection. I used to have Sonic Advance 3, I am having trouble looking for it. But Sonic Advance 2 is one of those games I've kept around, not necessarily because I think it's the best Sonic game, but it is a really good one with a really good art style. It introduces Cream the Rabbit, which is an adorable rabbit person thing in Sonic lore. This game is really cool. In fact, it was really cool to see modern Sonic in a 2D landscape. I'd never played the original Sonic Advance, but Sonic Advance 2 was the one I started off on, and it was a really good one. Had a little bit more story into it, and I really liked modern Sonic as a kid. Don't know how I feel about him now. He's gone through a lot of changes, but modern Sonic at this point in time was still kind of cool for me. I really enjoy Sonic Advance 2, and Sonic Advance 3 is also really cool. You can find that one for like 25 bucks. I think that one tends to be the most expensive one. So the next platform I'm going to be talking about is kind of a weird one because it's Super Mario Advance 2. I don't have Super Mario Advance 1, but I do have Mario Advance 2 and 3. And this one includes a couple Mario games along with this one. Now I believe this one, which is Super Mario Advance 3, contains Yoshi's Island and Super Mario World. Oh, I'm sorry. So this contains Yoshi's Island and Super Mario 3. This one contains the original Mario Brothers and Super Mario World. And then the original Mario Advance comes with the original Super Mario Brothers and Super Mario Brothers 2, if I'm not mistaken. So Mario Advance 3, if you get all 3 games, you basically have all like the original Mario games, at least the mainline ones. It's just a little bit hard for me to go back to because Super Mario World and all these Mario games are on so many other platforms and like HD now, and I have a Wii U that has a lot of these games already preloaded on it, and if I ever feel like going back to those original Mario games, I have that console which lets me play it on TV with like save states and stuff like that. So yeah, I don't know. These games are still fun to have. They're still cute to have in my collection, and I just enjoy having them. So yeah. Next platformer on the list is a platformer I honestly have not touched since the second level and as a kid, and that's Tim Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas, The Pumpkin King. Now, I know this is gonna sound weird, but this gives some extra lore to the Nightmare Before Christmas landscape. It kind of explains the reason why Oogie Boogie is so scared of Jack and all that stuff. As a kid, it's a cool game to play. As an adult, it's very frustrating. It's just game design wise, you could have done better, Disney. You could have done a lot better. And believe it or not, that's kind of it for platformers that I have. The rest of them tend to be RPG and other miscellaneous titles. Let's go ahead and talk about Mario Kart Super Circuit. I'll be real with you, I've never played this. I got this with the Game Boy Micro. Another reason why I recommend Mercari, a lot of people will bundle these things together. Mario Kart Super Circuit was one of them. Would I play this now in 2021? Probably not, because I have no one to play with, and I didn't grow up with it. So to me, it's kind of not worth it. And there's a couple Star Wars games I do want to mention. I have Lego Star Wars 2, the original trilogy. Haven't played this. This was another game that came as a bundle. But I did play a lot of Star Wars Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith for the Game Boy Advance. Funny enough, this was the first Game Boy Advance game I ever owned. And that just comes down to the fact that I got the Game Boy Advance during the same time as Star Wars Episode 3, which was one of my favorite movies as a kid. That was really cool that they actually took the time to make a really decent beat-em-up Star Wars type of game. However, if I try to play it nowadays, it is a little funky to get through. The difficulty is just crazy in some places, but Star Wars Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith it's fun. It's a fun beat-em-up type of Star Wars game for the Game Boy Advance. I don't really have much to say about it though, because the story is this exact same from the movie. You just get to play as Anakin and Obi-Wan from two different perspectives. But it's a fun game. If you have a Game Boy Advance, this is really easy to find. You can get it for like $5 to $10, I believe. It's not a waste of time, and actually I think it's probably worth like $5 to $10. Like, it's about that price. Now, Sonic Battle is a weird game because it's supposed to be a sequel to Sonic Advance 2, but it's also supposed to be a prequel to Sonic Advance 3. It actually has a pretty interesting story for a Sonic game, I could say, but the gameplay, as a lot of Sonic games are in this area, is a bit shoddy. Sometimes it's really fun, but sometimes it's pretty freaking hectic. I guess what really sold it was Sonic and Shadow fighting in the cover, and that Shadow had a bunch of chaos powers, and they were just doing some like Dragon Ball Z fighting moves in here, so it was just kind of cool. Speaking of Dragon Ball Z, it would be kind of weird if I didn't talk about some of my favorite Dragon Ball games, which was Dragon Ball Z Legacy of Goku 1 and 2 and Boo's Fury, also known as the Legacy of Goku trilogy. Boo's Fury is part of this trilogy. They play almost exactly the same, except for some reason they called it Boo's Fury instead of Legacy of Goku 3. Don't know why. But regardless, these games are really fun and really cool. Legacy of Goku 1 is probably one of the worst games I've ever played. But Legacy of Goku 2 is really fun. I don't know who changed in development to make that quality jump, but somehow they did it. Very short games, action RPGs, believe it or not. If you have Legacy of Goku 1, 2, and 3, you basically go through the entirety of Dragon Ball Z. I have a fun time with these games. Maybe not part 1 so much, but I usually skip on to part 2 and Boo's Fury anyways, since the Cell Saga is still the best saga in my personal opinion. Funny enough though, I do have the box for Boo's Fury. It's beat up to hell, but it's something I do have. I thought I would mention it before moving on because I was about to move on and realized that I had the box sitting here, and it would have been a little awkward if I didn't at least mention that this was the only Game Boy game where I had the box still. And it's just because at the time the Game Boy Advance games used this cardboard box, which was kind of a weird move on Nintendo's part because these don't really last. You have to really get protective sleeves, which I have seen people get, and I should get them. But the thing is, I only have one box, which makes it kind of pointless in my opinion to get those sleeves because I only get one. But maybe in the future when I get really serious about collecting more Game Boy Advance titles in their like complete box, I'll probably look into getting those sleeves. So the next game on the list is The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap. This is one of my favorite Zelda games. It's just really cute, really fun. There are some limitations to it obviously because you have to constantly go to the start menu to switch items, but I found this to be one of my favorite Zelda games actually. Maybe top 10, I wouldn't say top 5. I just really love the art style. I find the puzzles to be really engaging, and it was a very short adventure, one of the shortest Zelda games to date. I also love the way that Link controls in this game as well. I do have to do a Zelda collection video at some point because I love Zelda so much. Next up is Sword of Mana. This is a remake of Final Fantasy Adventure, also known as basically the first game in the Mana series. I had personally never played this game as of yet. I know it's something I want to get to. I just recently had got it though. So it's something I plan to get to. I know that they have the collection for Switch, and this is a remake of that first second Daitsetsu game, you know, the first Secret of Mana, the first Mana game if you will. And it's something I do want to kind of go through at some point. But yeah, my Sword of Mana, really cool. Next up on the list, Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories. Now this is a game I have a lot of memories with because I am a huge Kingdom Hearts fan. As you can kind of clearly see. That being said though, growing up I didn't exactly like the battle system in this game, as a lot of people did not. Some people love it. I think I would have liked it if they didn't force you to grind as much. There is a remake on the PlayStation 2, 3, 4, etc. I guess they're gonna redo it on PS5. It's also on PC now, through the Chain of Memories, which is part of a bunch of Kingdom Hearts collections that you can get. So there is a remake of this Game Boy title in like PS2 graphics, which is like a big jump in graphical fidelity. For some reason I prefer the graphics in this but the gameplay in that, if that makes sense. Just because there were times when moving in a 3D space that I felt more natural as a Kingdom Hearts fan, where in a 2D space things didn't necessarily line up properly. I don't know how to explain it, but I do love these graphics and the music that they introduced in here. In fact, I think this is the first game where they introduced lazy afternoons before Kingdom Hearts 2 was a thing. Chain of Memories I actually think was a really cool experiment for the Kingdom Hearts series. It does get kind of crazy at this point in the series going forward because you kind of need to play this one in order to play Kingdom Hearts 2. I do have fond memories of this game. Maybe if I replay it I might hate it, but I love Kingdom Hearts and I really did enjoy the Game Boy title, so that's Chain of Memories. And the final two games on the list are Golden Sun and Golden Sun, I believe 2, The Lost Ages. Now I haven't had time to play these games as of yet because I know they are long RPGs, and I'm always very wary when playing long RPGs just because while I do love RPGs, they do take up a lot of my time and I think about all the other games I could be playing. However, in this case, this is something I do plan to get to somewhat soon, especially because I've always heard great things about these two titles. In fact, these were originally supposed to be one game and they were eventually split into two just because there was so much that they wanted to do in them. Golden Sun and Golden Sun of the Lost Age, I don't know too much about, which is probably a good thing. I haven't been spoiled about anything as of yet, but you know, they're just games that I really want to get into at some point, right? But yeah, I mean, Golden Sun, I don't really have too much to talk about it. I like the art style. I like Isaac's battle theme. That's a really cool battle theme. I like the idea of the RPG being so big that it needs to be into two separate parts. That also makes it really daunting for me to play through. And a lot of people tell me it's like a top 10 RPG, so I guess I gotta give it a shot at some point. And that concludes my Game Boy Advance collection, the system, the games, my opinions on where to buy them, some other tips, the accessories, everything. This video took forever to record. I am sure it's going to take a hell of a long time to edit. I am sure I have some audio things going on just because my neighbors are doing a little bit of construction, but if you made it this far, Thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope my advice was helpful when it came to buying tips. If you have any questions or you want to talk about your own Game Boy collection, please go ahead, comment below. I do engage in these types of videos because I just enjoy talking about these systems and collecting. Well, I mean, I don't know what else there is to say, to be honest with you. Just thank you. I hope we can talk about another game collection soon. There's a lot of other collections I've thought about doing, so I can give my insight on maybe a certain game series. But if you have one game series that you would like me to talk about, go ahead, comment below, let me know. And until then, until I see you next time, take care.